Recording. Okay, hello everyone. This week we will introduce user authentication for the one part of computer security. As you see from the first picture in this slide, user authentication is actually a part of access control. By access control, it means a system needs to have a measure to control some access request to its resource. How can the system have this kind of control? Well, we need to have a layered function and requirements for each layer. And this is general steps in access control in most systems. So normally when a user wants to access to a system, then the user needs to show its identification, show its ID to a computer system. And then the system will perform an authentication process, which basically verifies the user's identification to make sure the user is the right person, right entity it has claimed to be. Then after that, the system gives access to this authenticated user. Then different users in a system should have different privilege rights. It shouldn't be like all users have same level of privilege or rights in a computer system. It's the same as in an organization. Like in UIB, the director should have normally higher rights than other employees in the university. And in a course, me as a lecturer should have more rights than you as a student. Then the system normally will distinguish different entities into different roles and only allow authorized entity to access some resource. And after that, the system should also have some auditing function to keep track of all the activities and events in a system, just in case that some malicious behavior has happened, then the entity who has done these malicious behaviors could be tracked. That's the idea of access control in a system. So we will introduce access control in this week, and today we will focus on user authentication. Yes. Okay, now I will, I'm fine with it. Yeah. I agree with you. But for all of you, if you don't have a question, please unmute yourself. Okay? Excuse me, please mute yourself. If you have a question, then you can unmute yourself. I trust you to obey this rule. Otherwise, I have to mute all of you. Okay, let's start. So use authentication. And yeah, you shall obey. Thanks, Oscar. That's true. And this user authentication, in fact, has several measures. And we now will focus on password-based authentication. And in the lecture, we will mention token-based authentication and biometric authentication. These two parts will be introduced in quite brief manner. instead of quite a detailed introduction and analysis of as in password-based authentication. So let's take a look at identification. Oh, it's very basic. As in the real world, when you travel to some other countries, you need to go through the passport check. Then you are supposed to show your passport, your ID to the officer inside. And this is identification process in the real world to tell a person or a system behind that who you are. In the digital world, this is what we normally experienced. And we need, when we want to log in to a system, when we want to get some service from a website, then we normally need to log in as a registered user in the system. Then we enter in the username and the password to show to the backend system who we are. This is a process of identification. So as you see from this description, it's simply a process that presents an identifier to computer systems in cyberspace. And in this process, this identifier is expected to be unique to this person. It shouldn't be some weak information about this person. It should be uniquely bound to this person. That's what this identification indicates. Here I have a question for you. What kind of information can be used to identify you? What kind of information? Anyone give me a personal number, bank ID? Yeah, thanks. Date of birth. Date of birth, do you really think that could be identifiable information of you? Some of the answers, yeah, your look, yes, biometric information, eye scan, retina scan, yes, you are great. So you list most of the information I have here. So in most of cases, we have full names. Like your full name in this course is supposed to be unique to you. If I was not mistaken, there's no duplicated names in our course. And then your email address with the university, it should be also unique in this course at least. And you haven't mentioned personalized secrets. Sometimes it can be also used to identify you. And of course, some biometric characteristic of a person is a very important identifiable information. Like here, there's a skin color and hair color, that's quite weak. But for fingerprint, for eye retina, and especially under-mentioned DNA of someone, that's uniquely, rather uniquely bound to a person. All of this information can be used to identify a person, but somehow only a few of this information can provide very good, very high level of identification. And for the listed information, think a little bit. Can this information provide 100% guarantee to identify you? For biometric information, that's mostly yes, like DNA. For fingerprint, mostly yes. For eye retina, mostly yes. That's a very high level of guarantee that this information can be identify a person. But for some other information, like a full name or username in a system, email addresses, personal secrets kind of has a higher abundance of a person, but not necessarily unique. And for all of this information, it can be used to identify a person. And here I remember I have a figure here, no? And previously I remember I have I would like to recommend you a film that's titled Face Off. It's about your look, your face, whether your face can be used to 100% identify you. Not really in some extreme case. The reason we discuss about what kind of level this information can be used to identify a person is because when we go to the next step, the authentication, we will use some of this information to authenticate, to verify a person. The movie I would like to recommend you is called Face Off. I will show you the movie link during the break. So now let's come to the next step, user authentication. Before this, we need to think a while. What kind of information can be uniquely or can provide high level of guarantee that the information can be used to identify a person? Because only that question can be properly answered. Can we have good user authentication? Only it can be properly formulated. Can we have proper steps to verify this information, which is bound to a person? So we all experienced in daily life, we have different measures to allow a user to access a system. We use password a lot. We use PIN code when we enter this department building, or when we use our bank card to buy something. Sometimes we use a security token. And in today's technology, more and more authentication measures is based on biometric information. In most of these cases, we assume that this information is closely bound to a person. It means that this information shouldn't be provided by others, right? Otherwise, user authentication won't take action properly. It's very important for access control in a system. Only when the first line, the system is very clear about who has been allowed access to the system, then the system and also these steps is done properly, correctly, in a right way. Only after that, the system can have proper control of which entity access what kind of results in the system. Otherwise, it will be a mess. And in most of systems, if we think of this user authentication like in general term, some of these measures, including biometric information, in today's technology, it provides a pretty good protection or pretty good guarantee for authentication. But maybe in the future, some of this biometric information is not enough. I think some of you have seen some movie or films that some people's fingerprint were stolen, even with eye retina. There's some high quality camera that capture a target face and then extract the retina information of the target person. Then this information was kind of recovered, or then is later used to access some system. Well, it occurs in many movies, and maybe in later, especially with this artificial intelligence, with more advanced technology and algorithms, it could be done. So this is also another reflection or indication. Cybersecurity itself, it evolves along with other technologies. It's not a static technology. It's a dynamic process. So let's look at typical ways of user authentication in today's system. The first three is what we used. We all use it, I think. The first one is based on the knowledge of what a person knows, like a password, a PIN code, some special question, and only the person has an answer. So this is also set up in some websites account registration, and to have a little bit extra information about the user. You may be asked to provide some question and provide answer to that question. Like in Apple, in Microsoft, in many app websites, they have this functionality in the registration phase. Another one is based on what a person has or what a person possesses. Quite typical examples include some token, like a key card. For example, you have a student card, which allows you to enter some buildings in the university. And you have physical keys, probably you can access to some of the studying hall. I'm not quite sure about it, but when you go back home, then you have this physical key. Only you keep this key, you hold this key, then you can access to your room. And the third category is based on what a person is, or this is about biometric information or biometric characteristic of a person, like a fingerprint, retina, and face pattern. In today's technology, I think I haven't used any device which requires eye retina, but we all use this fingerprint with many mobiles and for face recognition as well. And when I was back in China 2 or 3 years ago, like we have a payment system that face recognition is used as a way of user authentication. So upload a picture, an image of myself to the system. Then after that, if I take a subway, take a bus, and there's a screen, then and a camera, and then I just need to stand there. Then they take my face and recognition, and then in most cases, I can be allowed to use some service, like to take a bus or take a subway. And the more advanced way of user authentication is what a person does. This is more advanced, and it tries to use dynamic biometric information for a person. Like a voice pattern, it's not that easy to forge a person's voice pattern. But again, with artificial intelligence, if nowadays, I think it's relatively easy to copy a person's voice and then analyze the pattern of this person. It can be easily simulated. For handwriting, it's not that strong biometric information for authentication. Also, typing rhythm. I knew this, to be frank, from textbook, but I haven't seen any system use these measures to authenticate user. Personally, I have no experience with it. I think we are mostly familiar with password authentication, and it's still the most widely used authentication measure. And we will take a very close look at password authentication. And for password authentication, based authentication, especially in many Unix systems or Linux systems, these systems support multi-users to use the system to access resources at the same time. And these systems normally have this password-based authentication code, password-based authentication. They use the combination of the user's ID and the password for user authentication. And in the registration phase, the system initially stores the username and the password. And the user normally is asked to submit a username. Sometimes the username is set up by the system by default. For example, if you apply like register some account, like a Gmail account, then you can choose your username as your Gmail address or Gmail account. But in the university, they have more strict rules, and you get your user name for the university based on your full name, like your surname, and then it is appended with 3 digits. In general, so users will be asked to provide the username and the self-chosen password to the system. After that, if the user wants to access the system, then the system will check the user's input, compare it against the stored value. If it matches, the user is authenticated, indicating that the user will be given access to the system. So first, let's take a look at this ID. This ID in most of systems should be planned, should be known to at least the system administrator, because it will be used to determine whether this specific user can be authorized to access some resource in the system. whether this user is a normal user or whether this user is a root user or super user. And later on, we will learn access control. This user's information, user ID, will be used to determine whether the user has some permission to the resource based on access control list. And for password-based authentication, I think most of you are curious and interested in how password-based authentication is handled in many systems. So it's natural we have some questions about password authentication, based authentication. First, how to store passwords. I have mentioned a little bit in previous lecture when we introduced hash function. So now we will take a closer look at it. And the next is how to select a password. I think when you understand how a password can be correct, then you will have clear idea how to not to choose weak passwords. Then the last two, how to submit the password. When we register in a website, and how the password is sent to the backend server of that website. And for next time, when we try to log in, how the password is sent to the server for subsequent comparison against the one stored in the system. And if a user's input is incorrect, what kind of message should this user receive? I give you three options. You can compare which one is better. One is your input password is not correct. The second, your input username does not match with the password. The third one, there exists no there exists no entry in the system that maybe it's better. Okay, your input and the password is not a valid credential in the system. These three different messages sent to the user. Which one do you think is the best? First one? Yeah, the third one, yeah. Why? Can some of you give me an explanation? Why do you think the third one is the best? What exactly? It's for this. It's very subtle details. The system should give as little information to the user, or even sometimes to the attacker, not really user. Yes. Now let's look at how the first question, how to store passwords. I already mentioned in the initial usage, the username and the password are registered in the system. And then it will be stored in the system. It will be used to as a reference to compare with the subsequent input from the user. Let's start with some simple way of storing password. You may think this one, like if we have a user, then we in the registration phase, the system store the user ID and its password directly in the system. I think you can see the problem of this measure, but it was used, in fact, in 1970s. I believe you see the drawback. First, there's an inside attack that if a normal user or a root user or administrator user can access the database of the password, then they can easily learn other users' password. Even in Unix or Linux system, the normal user is not allowed to access some other user's resource, but there is a root user in the system. This root user is given access to all the information in the system. Then we have these inside attacks. Also, there's outside attacks. If an attacker, by some chance, gain access to the database, then the password will be released, will be uncovered to the attacker. Then we need a countermeasure for this issue. It's quite clear. We don't want to store password in the clear form. Then what about we store password in an encrypted form? So we have learned some encryption like AES or even DES. Then we take a key and encrypt the user's password. Then the ciphertext of this password is stored in the system. So we have the user ID and the ciphertext of the password based on some key. In this way, the password is protected. Is this a good way? What do you think of this way? Okay, previously the password is stored in a clear form. It's not good enough. Then we can encrypt it. Yes. The problem is, in most of cases, how to protect the key. In many cases, the key needs to be stored. And this is not necessarily an easy task. This way can be used in some system which store the user's key in a separate external device and protect that device physically or in much higher security protection. But it's not very convenient for general purpose usage in many computer systems, because we want to have this process as user-friendly as possible, right? Yes, someone could get hold of the key for this, exactly. If, in general, if we assume an attacker can access to a database of a password, in the same system, we could expect an attacker can get access to other information in the system as well, especially if the system's root account is compromised. As I described before, then the attacker can access all the information in the system. So we see this drawback, but to keep in mind, this way can be implemented in some system. If it's not for general purpose usage, for a small scale system, it can be used. Another one, we have learned hash functions, and in previous lectures I mentioned we can hash a user's password and store the hash of the password in a system. So the system stores the user ID and the hash of the password. That's the idea. So when the user submits the password next time, it will be again hashed and will be compared against the stored value. If it matches, okay, we are fine. Then the user will be given access to the system. If not, the user will receive a rejection. And in this case, before we discuss some problems with this measure, let's consider what kind of the property we need for the hash function. What are the properties we want to have with the hash function, such that in this way, we can have pretty good protection on user's password? Low collision. Anders mentioned low collision. What if there's a collision? Then what's the problem if the hash function has a collision issue in this context? Why do we need low collision? Yes, that's true. Now, in this case, the attacker only needs to have the correct hash. If the hash is correct, then we have the user will be given access to the system. But if the hash function itself, it's not properly chosen, it's not strong enough, that an attacker can find a collision of this password. And this we mentioned, it's the weak collision. So given a password, there's another input which have the same hash of this password. I see Agnes mentioned, what about we have user ID and the password? This is a tendency or sometimes even misunderstanding that it will be better, but not necessarily in fact. We will discuss on this because the user ID in most of cases it will be loaned to the system administrator. And we don't assume a system administrator is an honest or a good guy. We can assume the root user is a bad guy as well. So in this case, with ID as the input of the hash function, then really increase the security. We mentioned this collision, and what about another property of this hash function we definitely need? Suppose a root user have had access to this stored information in the system, ID and the hashed password. What is the other property we need for the hash function in this context? The hash function should be one-way function, exactly. Otherwise, the attacker could be able to recover the password in the exact same way as the original password. So that's two properties we need for hash function. So it also means in this context, in this application of hash functions, we have to have these two properties. We have to use cryptographically strong hash functions instead of some weak hash functions. In the exercise of hash functions, I have given you a weak hash function. There are different ways to get a fixed size of an input. But for cryptography usage, most of them won't be strong enough. So as I mentioned, we basically assume the attacker has access to this stored information in a database, because we cannot assume the database itself won't be compromised someday. And before we continue to some more secure protection of hash function, let's discuss the security of this way. Okay, we only have this ID and hashed password. There are some attacks. I have a question from Christian mentioned, what if multiple users have the same password? Then the attacker will be able to notice that the hashes are the same, and he only needs to find a password for one user and gain access to multiple other users. That's a very good point, Christian, and that's what we will discuss. So you have already seen this simple way of using hash function is still not sufficient to provide enough security. And in this case, the stored hash is not unique to the user ID, or it only depends on the password. So multiple users with the same password will have the same hash. That's definitely not good for security. Before we discuss better measures of storing password, let's discuss some possible attacks with the previous one. What you have discussed is about the usage, like some security issues, but it's like we can fix these issues in some way, but we need to consider to analyze the security of a hash in this context, in this scenario. So there are several ways of attacks for the previous usage of hashed password. The first one is a brute force attack. And I remember in next slide, we have more introduction about brute force. I will give you first list this password, these attacks. For brute force attack, you can know the measure from its name. And not the second type of attack is called pre-calculated rainbow table attack. The third one is popular password attack. The third one is dictionary attack. These attacks are somehow rather simple, or the idea is quite easy to understand. And the techniques itself is not difficult to implement. So there are many tools that implement these 4 attacks. And you can find these tools in some websites, also directly in Kali Linux. That's one of the reasons I ask you to install Kali Linux in your system. Then you don't need to search around what kind of cracking tools I can use. You can directly log into Kali Linux and play with some of these cracking tools. I remember in Kali Linux, there are more than 10 password cracking tools. So let's first look at the password for the brute force attack on hashed password. We will briefly introduce the idea, and then we will have a 15-minute break, then we continue. No, that's a rather ambitious goal. I don't think anyone, at least I know, who are familiar with all the tools in Kali Linux. And the tools are updated, and there are more tools built in Kali Linux. I remember there are more than 400 tools. Each of them is not necessarily easy to use. On the other hand, I introduce this platform to you, then you know there are many tools. If you are interested in some of the tools, then you can play with it by yourself. Okay, let's come back to the brute force attack. The aim of brute force attack is if an attacker has one touched hash value or a set of hash values, then the goal of the attacker is to find the original password for one single touched hash value, or try to find as many original password as possible for many hash values. That's the aim of attacker. Yes, William. I will come back to your questions during the break. So the idea is quite similar as the previous one. The brute force attack, we try to start with a large set of all the possible passwords, then simply calculate each of the possible password and find its hash, then compare the hash with the touched hash. Of course, if it matches with the touched hash, we find the original password. If not, then we try next possible password. That's the idea. And the important information here for brute force a single password is how long it will take for this naive brute force attack. If we do some simple mathematical calculation, then we can think of, okay, if the system uses SHA-1 or SHA-2 for hashing the password, then we need to consider how many possible passwords that an attacker needs to try out. Another factor is how fast an attacker can compute the hash for each possible password. Then the division between these two will be the total time that a brute force attack can crack a single password. Let's take a 15-minute break, and we can continue discuss on this time cost for brute force. So before the break, we mentioned if we want to brute force a single hash value, then we can try all possible passwords, and until the password has the exact same hash with the touched hash. So if we think of this attack and try to formulate the time cost for this attack, then you can easily get this formula. So the time it takes for cracking this password is the number of all possible passwords divided by how fast the hash can be calculated. Here I have a very simple example, a question to you. So how many hours it takes to find a correct password which has 2 to the power 64 possible passwords with the hash calculation speed as 2 to the power 32 hashes per second? How many hours it will take? It's quite easy. Can some of you give me an answer? So the number of all possible password is 2 to the power 64. And the hash can be calculated 2 to the power 32 times per second. Yes, 2 to the 32 hashes per second. Yes, that's exactly, that's 2 to the power 32 seconds. So it's quite easy, right? Then I have a question for you. If you are an attacker, how would you speed up this process? Better GPU, yes. So you use better GPU, then you can speed up the calculation of your hash. That's one way. Rainbow table mentioned by Marius. More computers. Yes, that's a good idea. So from the attacker's point of view, what he can do is he tries to speed up the calculation speed of the hash. Emil mentioned dictionary attack. Here we are talking about brute force attack. So we need to try all the possible password until we find the password. In this case, we assume the user choose a random password in the password space. While for dictionary passwords, for dictionary attack, it's the dictionary is created such that it covers most likely passwords that can be guessed out, like some common words in English or some combinations or some commonly used password or even some password that have been hacked in some database. So the dictionary collects all these kind of possible passwords, but it's not necessarily exhaust a whole set of all possible passwords. That's true. You can speed up to crack a password by using dictionary attack in some cases, but not for a random password. Here, Thomas and Martin mentioned like more computers and also better GPUs. That's the way to increase the speed of the hash. And it's very useful to speed up the process when the attacker tries to crack one single password. And if the attacker tries to attack or crack a set of passwords, then of course, this way helps, and there's also some other ways. One way is to use some pre-computed table by yourself or by others. I think you agree that looking up a table is much faster than calculating a hash in many cases, right? So to speed up this, one measure is to, okay, attackers or a group of attackers, they pre-compute the hash of all possible passwords, then store the passwords, and it's a hash in a database, in a device. Maybe it's several terabytes for some password space, but it's doable. And if this table is built up, then all password can be attacked, can be cracked. That's a problem. And from attacker's point of view, this is rather effective. Although the process of pre-computing could be tedious and could be quite expensive, but it's like you complete the job once, then you use it for all future cracking. Yes, there are many this kind of dictionary table, but for this pre-calculated hash table, I'm discussing the possibilities and why the previous usage of hash functions like in this manner is not secure enough. You can find it, but nowadays it's not really useful. Marius mentioned this, I didn't remember exactly the term for this usage. In many systems, they set a threshold that the user can only try certain times, 3 times or 5 times. If the input is incorrect, then the user account will be blocked. It's a good way to stop some type of attack, but it's not sufficient to prevent administrators in a system who have access to the password hash. Then they can do it offline, try to find the password for that hash. Then there's no need to try more times than just once if the attacker can find out what's the original password. I have another question from Skage, mentioned this two-step verification. We will mention that later. Okay, let's continue. And for these pre-calculated hashes, I think you get an idea. An attacker or a group of attackers try to pre-calculate the hash of all passwords in the password space. Then they use it to calculate, to find certain touched hashes. It's very effective. Then we came to the question, normally how big is such a database? In the raw form, in general, it's not that practical to exhaust all the possible passwords in the pre-calculated table. If the password space is not big enough, it's doable, but in general, it wouldn't be doable for attackers. And for saving this storage space in the pre-calculated hash table, there are some ways to optimize the storage of this table. One way is to use rainbow table for plain hashed values. And for many weak database, without any other measure, directly use this ID and the password, hash of the password, using rainbow table can be very effective. The size is still big, like several terabytes is quite common. But when the attacker built up this table, then it can be used very effectively. I made a demo of using rainbow table to correct some hash password in Windows NT system. And I will share with you the demos afterwards. But today we don't have enough time, and I didn't bring my USB stick, which stores the rainbow table. It's several terabytes. For you to know, this rainbow table is like a trade-off between the time and the memory cost for brute force attack. So simple brute force requires too long time in most of cases, and we can simply enlarge the password space. Then we can increase the time for cracking a lot. Quite simple. And for pre-computed hash table, it's generally not feasible. Again, if the password space is big enough. This rainbow table, it takes a trade-off between these two measures. Then how to prevent rainbow table based attack? The idea is to add more information. Here, let's look at this formula. Then you will get the essential idea. So we have the hash, and of course, the attackers could upgrade their devices and equipment to speed up this hash. But even with today's advanced technology, even with parallel computing, then the factor of speeding up hash calculations will be limited, like 1,000 times than normal devices, even 10,000 times, even 1 million times. Still it's quite limited. And as a security professional or as a security expert, or even as a normal user, how would you protect your password according to this formulation? Well, you try to simply increase a password space. For all the previously mentioned attacks, which based on this brute force attack idea, if the user choose a very long password, or the system itself, it allows unlimited length of the password from the user. then it's simply very difficult for the attacker. Are you with me, this idea? We want to increase, suppose there are some different type of attacks, which is more and more effective. Now, what a user can do or what a system can do is to increase the password space, to make it bigger and bigger. Is the password space the same as the password length? That's a question from Marius. That's a very good question. I should emphasize this. For the password space, we can consider if we have a password length as 10. So for each position of this password, what are the characters we can choose? That's a question to all of you. What kind of characters, what kind of the symbols we can choose as the user in today's computer system? What are the symbols we can? It depends, alphabet, numbers, and some characters. In many systems, it allows all possible keys in the keyboard. Unicode some places, yes. In some places, they support Unicode. That's even better. So let's change to the iPad screen. This is a very good question. I lost the information, the image. I don't know how to change to. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4 passwords. So let's look at the password space. In fact, it equals like possible symbols. That's a base. And then the password I directly write length. That's a calculation. Hunter 2. And for symbols, if we choose only characters or letters, like a character, wait, character is a general term, letters. So I use English keyboard. Then for lowercase letter, I have 26. And for uppercase, lowercase. For uppercase letter, I have another 26. But for you mostly use a Norwegian keyboard, so you have 29. These possible letters in your keyboard. And we have the digits, 10 digits. And we have several other punctuations, special symbols, special symbols. Special symbols. And in US English keyboard, we have in total 97 possible choices. Suppose in a user's password, this user is quite clever. He or she choose all the combination of this, all the possible combination of it, and he choose the password names as 10. We have names like 10. Okay, then we have the password space is 10 to the power 97. That's the size of this password space. It means if it deals with, excuse me, here I made a mistake. It's 97 to the power 10. How many choices in Chinese? That's a good question, William. In many systems, it does not allow direct Chinese characters. Otherwise, wow, that's big. That's really big. It's for Chinese characters, it's more like English words. Then you can think of how many words you can use as space. That's a very good question. And now you have this idea. If we have a very, very rough estimation, so 97 is between 64 and 128. And we can see it's in the range of 2 to the power 6. That's 64 to the power 10. Here the other one is 2 to the power 7 to the power 10. So it's in between. It's 2 to the power 60, 2 to the power 70. That's the possible, all the possible passwords in this example. And if you increase the length of the password, like from 10 to 12 or even to 16, then it's much larger. And if you do some basic calculation for making this pre-calculated hash table, then you have at least 2 to the power 60 entries of the passwords. And you do some calculation, like you have byte, that's 2 to the 3, and then you have kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes. That's 2 to the power 12. That's 2 to the power 40. So 1 terabyte is 2 to the power 43 bits. It's not big, right? Then if you have 2 to the power 60 or 2 to the power 70, still you have 2 to the power around 20, 30 terabytes. It's generally infeasible to attackers. Are you with me with this calculation? So you see the now the essential idea why we need to have a strong password. What do we mean by a strong password? So you increase the base, all the possible symbols for each position in the password. And also you keep large lengths of your password. Well, of course, from security perspective, if you choose more than 30 bits, 30 or like more than 60 in your password, then it's super secure. Now, what's the problem? If you choose if a user is required to choose a very long password, what's the problem? Remember, exactly. It's difficult to remember. Like for normal users, even one user use a single password for all his or her account. Like I consider 20 characters or 20 symbols is literally the limit or the maximum. Reuse same password on multiple systems. That could be a problem, yes. In fact, if a user can remember more than 30 symbols in his or her password, even you reuse it, it's not necessarily a big issue, in fact. And Tado asked me whether I use password software. I don't use. I got the similar questions from students. We can come back that later. After the lecture, I can have some discussion with you. And then how can we enlarge the password space without creating some hindrance or some inconvenience to the users? Well, the way is to introduce extra information, which is random, difficult to guess, but it's also an input of the hash, like here. This is called sort. It's simply a randomly generated information, which is different from each password. So we have this this way. In this case, the user only needs to remember the password, and the system will automatically generate a sort value, which is normally 30 bytes or 16 bytes. It's recommended that the sort value has the same size as a hash. That's a little bit kind of scary if you consider the length, right? I mean, if a hash function have, like we use like SHA-256, then if the sort value has, okay, again, 256 bits, and the space will be 2 to the power 256 times the original password space. Then there's no way for an attacker to compute a pre-calculated hash table or to compute a rainbow table. Or it's also impossible for an attacker to brute force simply one by one. This is the idea of using sort in protecting password in many systems. It's called sorted password. So in this case, the sort is supposed to be unique for each password. Previously, one of you mentioned if different users use the same password, then in a system, if that hash is correct, then it will cause a problem for all the users with the same password. But with this sort information, since the sort is different for different password, even for same password for different users, the sort will be generated in a different way. And the input of this hash will be totally different, even with the same password here. Then in this case, even same password used by different users, the hash of them will be different. Okay, since we are close to the end of the lecture, I will finish 2 slides of our lecture, and then I will answer your question one by one. So let's look at the practice in many systems. Well, when the system stores the user's login information in the registration phase, it stores the user ID and stores the sort value, which is generated when the registration is taking place, and then store the hash for these 2 inputs. I mentioned for this sort value, it's at least 32 bits, but in many cases nowadays, it is recommended to have the same length as the hash function used. To make it even harder for attackers, like previously, some of you mentioned to use more computers at the same time. That's for paralleling computing, and also use GPU, which can calculate the hash more efficiently. But to further avoid or further prevent this type of attack from the attackers, then in practice, the hash functions is used with some slow hash functions, or like here there are some examples. This bcrypt or scrypt. It's used in Unix-based system, and pbkdf. I mentioned this before, and if you remember, there's some iterations in pbkdf too. This idea is to increase, to make the attackers parallel computing of this hash function, or based on some GPUs, not possible, or to at least to make it more difficult. And in all the designs of systems for storing password, and there's a general principle that we have mentioned several times. That is to assume that the password database can be or will be eventually compromised, will be uncovered to the attackers. And based on this assumption, then how can we protect the security, or how can we provide enough security even though all the password database can be accessed by attackers? So in practice, we use this idea. In the end, the reference for some of you, if you are interested, I have this password security, past, present, and future. It's a slide given by a researcher in a security company. You can see it's the process of how password storage in a system is developing and is upgrading better and better. In the beginning, it's just a simple hashed password, or even before, that's only plain text password. But nowadays, it's more and more secure. We can stop our lecture now, and then I can answer your questions one by one.